This weekend, the latest Zack Snyder film, Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver, drops on Netflix. So let's talk about it. Hi, my name is Sean, and I love to talk about movies and TV way too much. With that in mind, go ahead and join me down below in the comment section. Let me know, what did you think about Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver? And let me know your thoughts on Zack Snyder as a director in general. He is one of these directors that everyone has a strong opinion about, and that gives a point of reference for how you are responding to Rebel Moon, and I would love to hear what you have to think about it. As for me, I'm a big fan of Zack Snyder simply because he's a director with an actual distinct style and voice. In an era when there's so many big, gigantic blockbusters that just feel written and directed by committee and then reworked by AI to optimize for algorithms, you have a director like Zack Snyder that, love him or hate him, he actually elicits a response from an audience. And a lot of the movies that he makes, not all of them, are just very much my kind of thing, and I like what he brings to the table. Then again, sometimes he has some gigantic misses too. He has some pretty obvious faults as a director, but whenever he has something new coming out, I'm naturally very curious. If you didn't see my review for Rebel Moon Part 1, I was not a fan of that film, so I was going into Part 2 very skeptical. Was the movie able to win me over? Let's start the review. And unfortunately, while I did think that Part 2 was marginally better than Part 1, I still don't think it actually works all that well as a film in its current form. Now, I think it's better on the simple basis that the third act of this film is just bigger in scope and size. It is the actual resolution to the conflict that was started at the beginning of the first film. So by the end of it, you have some resolution to the primary conflict of these two films, and that just makes for a more satisfying viewing experience overall. But I think that Part 2 essentially has virtually all of the exact same problems as Part 1. It also has the same strengths as Part 1, which is to say this is sort of Zack Snyder's Star Wars. It's sort of his cover version of Star Wars, in which case it's just kind of fun to be in this type of setting with these types of scenarios. I like this kind of thing. I like Zack Snyder's directorial style. Put the two together, and there's just a lot of things in there that are just my kind of thing. Space battles, laser swords, blasters, chosen ones, redemptive arcs, underdogs. I love all that stuff. And Zack Snyder has an eye for iconic imagery. And so you get all of that in here. But does it ever in any way live up to the potential, in my mind, of what Zack Snyder can actually do doing his version of Star Wars? No, I don't think either one of these films comes anywhere close to what I think Zack Snyder should be able to deliver. And so much of that simply comes down to the fact that Zack Snyder is a very strong visual director. He's not a strong writer. And he never has been. When you look at his filmography and which ones are towards the top in his better films and which ones are towards the bottom, all the ones that he has story credit on, all the ones that he wrote the screenplay for, they're towards the bottom. And all the ones that are based on other people's ideas and other people's scripts, those are the ones towards the top where his strengths are highlighted and his weaknesses are minimized. When it comes to Rebel Moon, it feels an awful lot like all of his weaknesses, all of his excesses are heavily on display with none of his strengths in both of these films. And it's a little bit of an odd scenario in particular because, once again, this is supposed to be sort of like Zack Snyder's Star Wars. It's an idea that he's had going back decades ago.
The origins of Rebel Moon, the first time I think had a snapshot of what it could be was, I think it was up at Art Center when I was a student. I had a class on, you had to do like a one-line pitch you know? And I was like, what about Dirty Dozen, Seven Samurai, but in space? And my professor was like, that's actually good.
Which is not a bad idea for a film, though it already exists 40 years ago called Battle Beyond the Stars. They also did essentially a Mandalorian episode with this exact same premise. This is a good idea. It's just already been done before multiple times, and even with the specifics to it, feels like he pulled in a little bit of a Bug's Life into it. So even the idea that's kind of good here already feels a little bit derivative by the time that it's getting made. So what he has to offer is the thing that I talked about in my intro about why I love Zack Snyder, is that he has a unique, distinct voice, a distinct perspective that I think he brings to the table with a lot of his stories. But you don't get that in this version of these films. It is well documented that Zack Snyder, his idea, his pitch was an R-rated version of Rebel Moon, but Netflix didn't want to fund a hard R version of Rebel Moon. They wanted to fund a PG-13 version of it. They are willing to give him the money to make both, but he has to deliver a PG-13 version, and that's what we're watching. Today's video is brought to you by BetterHelp. In life, it's so easy to get so wrapped up in the urgent that we're just reacting to everything happening all around us, and we never stop to think, what will actually make me happy? And therapy can help you realize what you really care about and make that your priority. If you don't know my story, when I started this YouTube channel, I was unemployed and in an alcohol treatment program. I was just being crushed by the stress of life and turned to alcohol to cope with everything going on. I didn't know where to turn for help, and I wish that 12 years ago I had turned to therapy instead of alcohol. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online and designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. If you're struggling in life, you don't have to do it alone. There is help out there. Visit betterhelp.com/Sean Chandler today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/Sean Chandler. Over the last couple of weeks, I've been watching a bunch of Zack Snyder interviews, and one of the things he's mentioned multiple times is that the advice that he gives to prospective filmmakers is the most important thing they have to offer is their perspective.
Your point of view is the most important thing there is. Like you, the prism that the world kind of reflects through, is everything. Anyone can make the shots, but what they can't do is see the world the way you see it. That's your currency.
Elsewhere, he talked about how directing is essentially the management of an idea.
Directing is like the managing of an idea.
The exact reason that a bunch of us love many of Zack Snyder's films is that he brings that unique perspective to specific genres. Whether you're talking about zombie movies with Dawn of the Dead, or classic heroism and Greek mythology with 300, or of course what he did with the DCEU and Batman and Superman and the Justice League. He has a distinct way that he views heroes. And I went into Rebel Moon wanting to see what would he bring to the sci-fi genre. And in interviews, he said that's the reason he kept coming back to this Rebel Moon idea.
I kept coming back to it because I really had something to say about the sort of tropes of sci-fi. I just couldn't get it out of my head that there's got to be a why of it, and how do we break it?
His unique perspective that he wants to bring to the genre, he described it as hard R, extremely violent, over the top, very sexual, and actually satirical in nature because it's designed to comment on the tropes of the genre.
In the R-rated versions of the movie, everything is amplified. The R-rated versions of the movie have a slightly more satirical, the PG-13 movies end up being pretty earnest. They don't have sort of sex and violence to over the top them. That in the R-rated versions, because the violence is so over the top and the sex is so over the top, that the tone changes.
But that's not what they released in December, and that's not what they released this weekend. What we're getting right now is the Netflix version, where they strip away all of Zack Snyder's perspective, his ideas about the genre, and you just do a straight version of it. He described it as the earnest version, the non-satirical version, the non-let's comment on the genre version. It's just the earnest version.
It allows the comment on the genre to be a little bit more obvious.
Right.
Where I feel like in the PG-13, it's just more straightforward, like this is a actioner with the sci-fi elements, where I feel like the R-rated version is a little bit just weird.
A little weirder, right? Yeah.
It's just weird. And you're just really like, oh, wow, like, it makes you think about genre and it makes you think about sort of what's possible in sci-fi and what's not.
He even went so far as to essentially say the director's cuts are designed to be deconstructions of this version of the film.
It's kind of ironic. So I wrote this very extreme R-rated bizarro sci-fi movie to test it.
Right.
But now you've gotten the earnest version first. I'll deconstruct my own movie with the director's cut. So
that's hysterical.
It's a closed loop.
Which means the versions that we're watching right now strip away all of Zack Snyder's fresh new ideas, strip away anything that would make Rebel Moon interesting, and we're just left with a derivative pair of films. We've seen this movie before. We've seen this plot before. It's just a bad copy of multiple better films without any of that perspective that Zack Snyder has advised other people that is the most important thing you have to offer. And he stripped it away for the first version of Rebel Moon that he put out in the world to appease Netflix. In all of these interviews, he's extremely critical of essentially how Warner Brothers used focus groups to change his movies in post-production.
What happens is in the focus groups and in the studio screenings, people get ideas about the movie. And what happens is, inevitably for me, the movie will get changed based on studio opinion and things like that.
Without realizing that essentially he's letting Netflix do the same thing just on the front end. But it's the same problem of allowing algorithms and big studio heads to chip away, cut away everything interesting about your concept and just giving us something bland and choppy.
Do they give you notes? Is that helpful for you at this stage in your career?
On the PG-13, of course. Process, a very collaborative process on this version of the movie. Like, I definitely listen to everything they have to say. They know their platform really well. And so these are all parameters that we put into the making of the film from the beginning. And then the R-rated version of the movie, the director's cuts, they're just like, show them to us when they're done. The best movies, the movies you love best, the movies I love best, are movies that are made by filmmakers with a very particular point of view. Mm-hmm. They're actually not made by the committee. They're not made in the, well, at least they don't feel like they are. Like the focus groups are far from them, I feel like.
And so now we have two of these Rebel Moon movies, still none of the characters are interesting. The lore feels empty in a sense. It feels like we've been told things, but it still feels kind of like at arm's length away from us. One of the strangest things about these two Rebel Moon movies that we have is that on the one hand, both of them feel like an hour was cut out of the film, and so they don't work because they're missing big, gigantic pieces. And at the same time, it feels like these two movies should just be one movie. All the movies that it takes influence from, Magnificent Seven, Dirty Dozen, Seven Samurai, A Bug's Life, all were able to tell this story of the village that hires the mercenaries to come in to save the day in under 2.5 hours. So it feels like the best version of this movie would have been 2.5 hours long, yet somehow both of these movies feel like they need an extra hour to make any sense. Like, it's this very strange situation where they're way too long, but also too short at the same time. So even when I evaluate some of the other specific issues about the films that were released, it's tough to know, is that because this is the incomplete version, or is that because Zack Snyder just kind of fumbled the storytelling in general? Even when we move into our big finale here, there's a bunch of cool shots in there, there's a bunch of cool moments, but still at the exact same time, there's all sorts of choices in the battle that don't make any sense, that the characters make, that they strategize, the way that it's structured just feels very clunky and bizarre. And I don't know if that's because they just structured it poorly, or is that because they're chopping together a bunch of pieces that are supposed to be something very different for the R-rated version. I don't know, but it's very choppy in its current form. I think that the Rebel Moon movies are examples of some of Zack Snyder's most excessive use of slow-mo in sections where it doesn't make sense. In all of these interviews, he discusses why he uses slow-mo so much, and when he describes it, it makes sense.
The use of slow motion to me is a way of just embellishing heroic moments that our heroes go through.
I like to sort of emphasize a moment compositionally, and it's hard to see it when it goes by so quickly.
Because I think I'm a fan of beautiful classic artwork or paintings, I like to kind of make the moments into those iconographic frames that you can hang on and see.
So you can think of a bunch of iconic shots from some of his movies where characters go into slow-mo and you go, yeah, that's an iconic image, and he let us pause to process it a little bit more. Then you watch Rebel Moon Part 2, and there's a bunch of slow-mo of grain. There's slow-mo of a character filling his water bottle. And like, these are not heroic moments. They're not iconic. They're not important, but they're in slow-mo. And so instead of slow-mo highlighting just great imagery or important moments, it just feels random. It has no additional meaning. You're just doing flashy stuff to draw attention to it.
I just saw Rebel Moon Part 2. There's nothing in there that's safe.
Yeah.
And I saw the PG-13.
Yeah, PG-13 is a joke.
Real quick, before I give you my final thoughts, be sure to join me down below in the comment section. Let me know, what did you think about Rebel Moon Part 2? And are you excited for the director's cuts that are coming? Or are you just so burned out on this entire thing that you just don't even care anymore? Also, I've been trying to review some of Zack Snyder's earlier films. You know, I've covered the DCEU stuff extensively on my channel, so I wanted to dive into his other films that were the ones that made me, love him before he did Man of Steel. So Dawn of the Dead, 300. I also covered Sucker Punch, though I don't love that one, but it's interesting and there's a lot to talk about there. I will pin a comment with links to my reviews. While I do think that Rebel Moon Part 2, The Scargiver, is a slight improvement over Part 1, it's only a marginal improvement, but this still just feels like a knockoff of Star Wars, with Zack Snyder not really bringing anything new to the table in its current form. And I can't even say I'm excited to see the true versions, because these versions put such a bad taste in my mouth. Overall, it's only a C on the entertainment scale of 5 out of 10, and that's really just because I like this genre. But you can skip this one. Just wait for the proper version later this year. Come back in a couple of days. I'll be ranking all of Zack Snyder's films, and I've been doing a pretty big deep dive to try and make that a really solid ranking. You can check out some of my other Zack Snyder reviews right over there. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies and TV too much. Bye-bye.